Doctor Who fans tonight were witnessing something truly special. The War Games, one of the most important stories in the show's history, has been reimagined in a way that we never have seen before. Colorized, condensed into a 90-minute feature, and even featuring a brand new Regeneration scene. This is a bold new take on a classic, but does it capture the magic and the weight of the original? For me, The War Games is a story that has always felt monumental. You know, I didn't grow up with it. I was born in 1978, nearly a decade after it was first aired. My first encounter with it wasn't until nearly 2 decades after that. And let me tell you, watching it back then felt like an event. It's a 10-part epic story. It's nearly 4 hours long. And I remember spending what felt like an entire day glued to the television, completely absorbed by its scale and its ambition. It was the story that introduced the Time Lords, revealing the Doctor's people, and it gave us Patrick Troughton's final, unforgettable performance as the Second Doctor. Watching it in black and white back then, it felt almost otherworldly, but now seeing it in colour, it's kind of like rediscovering it all over again. The colorization, the re-edit, the new Regeneration scene, it's a chance to revisit a story that has shaped the show's mythology and explore it in a whole new light. So join me as we dive deep into the War Games in colour. What's new, what's changed, and whether this reimagined version does justice to one of Doctor Who's most iconic stories. Let's find out as we go beyond the sofa. There's always a moment in these colorizations where you see the colour for the first time and it takes your breath away. You know, I haven't watched the War Games as much as I've watched other old classic stories, mostly because of the length. But there's some pretty iconic moments in those first few minutes of the story, and it was pretty magical to see those colorized. It almost brought them to life in a whole different way. And the colorization itself is incredibly good. They found better footage than what we had before for some scenes, so there's this significant upgrade in picture quality when you're watching this. It's not going to stand up in the same way that a 35mm film print would, but this is a lot like the difference between the DVD version and the collection set Blu-ray version of a story. And honestly, in terms of visuals, that's worth the colorization alone. But I can't be alone in thinking that the production overall is somewhat unbalanced. And whilst I'm a big fan of the colorization, of the restoration work that's gone into this, some of the new visual effects were enough to just take me out of the story at various points. If I take a look at this, and then I took a look at the recent Blake 7 box set and what they did with the visuals, they really did try to keep it in the style of the original. And the same can't quite be said here, where many of the effects look far too new against the older footage. Perhaps that's because even at this better quality of footage, it's not the sort of standard we would expect today. But I've just bought the standard edition of Season 2, and I've just seen the Daleks' invasion of Earth with the new effects for the first time, and they looked like the time had been spent to fit them into the original footage. And this is a problem that persists right until the end of the production, where we see a shot of Gallifrey, but really it kind of looks out of place because it's a stark contrast to everything else that we've seen before. It's so high definition, whereas the much lower definition footage that we've seen for the rest of the story makes it feel a little bit out of place. They've also done something which I was expecting them to do, but I was kind of hoping that they wouldn't. It's the moment where the Doctor regenerates and is shown all the faces that he might turn into. Well, that's now populated by the more modern versions of the Doctor. And I know that's the point of this endeavour, to get younger audiences into experiencing older stories. However, I don't think that they had to do that in order to get people connected with the show. You could have removed the pencil sketches, sure, of the original, and then made the last one John Pertwee without having to involve the new Who Doctors at all. And I honestly don't think that people coming to this story for the first time would be that disappointed at not seeing the most recent incarnations of the Doctor. That said, I do want to give this some praise. You know, the visual effects they're very well produced, even if I don't feel they quite fit into the same context as the rest of the footage. They are very well produced. special mention should be made of the new Regeneration sequence, which is an appropriated sequence from a YouTube channel, but it's been one of my favourite for quite some time, and I am really glad to see that being put into an official release. It's a bit of Doctor Who history that we've not had before, the actual change from Triton to Pertwee, and it does modernise the whole thing quite nicely, drawing a connection between the end of the War Games and the start of Spearhead from Space. Unfortunately, the things that let this release down are the editing and the music. And I do feel for the guys who have to edit this, because it cannot be easy taking something which is 4 hours long and then condensing it into an hour and a half. And I'm sure there are logistical or monetary reasons why they can't do longer stories. And if the option was to not have these colorizations at all, or to have them edited, I'd rather have them edited. Unfortunately, that means that the pacing tends to be a little bit all over the place. There are elements of this story which they're just completely cut out. And sometimes that works, because especially with the War Games, it's a big, sprawling, massive mess of a story. There are moments there that you feel that you should have known something was happening and we haven't seen it. Sometimes that matters, sometimes it doesn't. But we don't really see, for example, how the Doctor and the Rebels meet for the first time. And yet there he is, bossing them around like he knows everybody. And it just doesn't quite feel earned, I suppose. Packing so much story into such a short space of time does make the whole thing feel quite rushed and quite hectic. And sometimes that doesn't help with the new music, which I found at times was actually quite oppressive. This was a problem with the Daleks as well, where the music seemed to override everything, the actors, the whole thing. And also having so much of it and having so much energy and pace in the story meant that by the time that we were halfway through, I was feeling quite exhausted. I almost wanted to stop the thing and have a bit of a breather. And I feel like this is currently the biggest problem with these colorizations. There are moments where I just can't hear the dialogue at all. There are moments where the music is so overpowering that I'm almost getting heart palpitations just by listening to it. This extra sense of unease that the music produces also takes you out of the story at times. Some people have already mentioned that when the War Chief is seen, the music for the Master is played. Now, I'm not someone who thinks that that is a ringing endorsement that this character is meant to be the Master. I think that can still be part of your headcanon. You know, whether you like it or not, it's up to you. But if you know Doctor Who, and there are a lot of fans out there who know absolutely everything about Doctor Who incredibly well, even, the new Who stuff, then you'll recognise that, and it can feel a bit disorientating. The editing on the War Games is an awful lot better than it was on Daleks, and I think that's probably because there's an awful lot more story to play around with, and there are those unconnected story elements and beats that run through the War Games that could be relatively easily taken out. The pacing issue is really an issue of time. You have to get so much into a 90-minute episode that there was never really any chance that this wasn't going to feel rushed. It doesn't help that even though it's a long story, the War Games is actually quite well paced. Cutting it down was always going to be an impossible task. And for all of my criticisms of the editing, I'm not sure it could have been done any better. Overall, then, the War Games colorisation is probably something that most Doctor Who fans will want to see. I'm not sure that many will want to own the Blu-ray version of it. I'm not sure how the Daleks did in terms of Blu-ray sales and anything, but it's another way to experience the classic stories, and that's not a bad thing at all. One thing that really stands out here is how much better the Doctor, Zoe and Jamie look in colour. It's strange seeing them like that, but that alone makes this whole thing feel so much more modern. And as you'd expect, Pat Troughton shines through as the Doctor, and yet there's a fantastic cast around him as well. It's lovely seeing this TARDIS team anyway, but I suppose that's one of the big problems I have with the edit, because what we do lose is some of the interplay between those characters. And for me, one of the joys of the Troughton era is the relationship that he has with his companions, whether he's talking to Victoria in Tomb of the Cybermen, or whether he's arguing with Jamie, being berated by Zoe, all of those things. That's what really makes these seasons stand out. It's one of the reasons we keep coming back to them again and again. Some of that's missing missing, and with that, some of the soul of the story goes as well. But it's been an interesting experiment, and I'm really glad that we get to see these colorizations, which don't replace the originals at all, but they do give us something to watch and probably complain about every Christmas. That's what I think anyway. I'd love to know what your thoughts are in the comments below. I know this is the first video that I've made for quite some time, but we've got Joy to the World coming up in a couple of days, and I'll be making a video about that as well. If you get the chance, do go and see the War Games in colour. It's worth it, but it's also worth hanging on to the original DVDs because you are going to want that story in its original format. That's it for this particular video. Thank you ever so much for watching. And if you would like to like and subscribe and do all those things that us YouTubers ask you to do, then please do. We'll see you next time when we dare to go beyond the sofa.